half a kind of summary and half an interpretation, starting with the two principles, and then see where we stand in relation to the whole question of what it is that is most vital in Freud. Indeed, in the question of the two principles, I even wonder if one should turn directly to my notes. I'm not sure that I wouldn't rather consider the entire question of just why it is that he lines up matters in the rather curious way that he does. Look, for instance, at the opening of the two principles to begin with. Well, perhaps I will look at my notes briefly. The two principles are, of course, on the one hand, the reality principle, and the other is extraordinary, because of all things in Freud, it is what is most strangely named. He began by calling it the unpleasure principle. Then he called it the pleasure/unpleasure principle. Then he started to call it the pleasure principle, but it was always the same principle. And that is, of course, a profound kind of a problem, so perhaps I will read from these summarizing notes, though even I have gotten impatient with them, and see what kind of discussion it can lead to. And I think one has to start actually with the less problematic, but in the end the more controversial of the two, the so-called reality principle. And though this may seem rambling at first, I think it will lead us into discussion. Freud says of the reality principle, which is clearly of the two principles, the one which is, as it were, the one to which he is committed and to which his therapy and his vision is committed, that it modifies what we can call the pleasure-pain principle, whether you call that the unpleasure principle or the pleasure principle. That is to say, when the reality principle dominates and regulates, according to Freud, any quest for fulfillment on the part of our drives goes by those detours and postponements that are set both by the external universe and by society. And Freud, of course, thinks that this is the way it ought to be. This is the whole function. Freud speaks of what we could call three stances or attitudes towards the reality principle. In his terms, economic, topographical, and dynamic. And there's no mystery about those terms. From the economic stance, which is always the stance of the question of energy, which I must add is always in the end a mythological stance, because this is not a biological energy, whatever Freud said about it. The economic stance toward the reality principle is one in which the reality principle is seen as that which so regulates free energy as to transmute it into bound energy. From the topographical point of view, the reality principle is that which takes place in the pre-conscious conscious system rather than the unconscious. The id or the unconscious can have nothing to do with it. From the dynamic point of view, the reality principle is that which relies upon a drive in the service of the ego. So dubious that I think it's what finally caused Freud to abandon the earlier theory of the drives, in which the ego principle or ego drive was set against the libido, and led to the later, more radical dualism from beyond the pleasure principle, which will be the next reading that I'll ask you to do, not for 2 weeks, but for 3 weeks from today, where the whole issue of whether he got the theory of the drives right is proper. What is, I think, already, however difficult this may sound at first, what is already clear is that what Freud calls, let us say, the pleasure-unpleasure principle, or the pleasure-pain principle, is prior. It has priority. It is dominant. Freud does not want it to be dominant. When satisfaction does not take place, according to Freud, in each of our individual developments, that is the time when what he calls infantile hallucinations end, and the reality principle comes in, marked, he says, by the development of an attention span, by the judgmental aspects of the psyche, by the ability to remember, when thought itself starts at what he calls reality testing, when what he calls Besetzung, or his translator Strachey perhaps unwisely called cathexis, investment, is displaced, and free energy, as I've said before, from a economic stance moves to bound energy. But according to Freud, even when this happens, the pleasure-pain principle, or the unpleasure or pleasure principle, continues its rule over fantasy, that is to say, above all unconscious and primary processes. Now, Freud became very dissatisfied very quickly, and I think you can see this even in that essay on the two principles of mental functioning. Freud became very dissatisfied with this very quickly. He said this was a mere genetic psychology, and that is another reason for his giving up the notion that we had any drive which dealt with the self-preservation of the ego. Because he came to realize, and I think this is the essence of all 5 of the subjects that I hope, however briefly, we'll discuss today, that sexual drives can be educated, as alas all of us know, only partially and belatedly. Now, if you have a partial and belatedly working drive, then you have certainly some kind of dualism invariably made between the ego, between the supposedly conscious aspects, because this is Freud still prior to the notion that the ego is largely unconscious or narcissistic anyway. There's a constant dualism between the ego and the unconscious. Freud, I think, gave this up as a view for a lot of reasons. First of all, because he could not explain, and this is something one always has to come back to in the context of a literary point of view, Freud could never explain why it was that we didn't all stay hallucinated in the first place. And I don't mean to be ironic about that, and I don't mean to be bitter, I don't even mean to be witty. It was a perpetual problem for him. And his anaclesis, or Anlehnung, his propping of sexuality on the ego, as you will see in the reading in the 3 essays in theory of sexuality, simply begs that question. Now, if you can't explain why the infant is not willing to reside in a state of hallucination, if you can't explain why we are vulnerable to reality testing, then you can't explain what reality testing is. And I'm very much afraid, now of course if I were Lacanian I wouldn't have to be afraid, but since I would like to feel that Freud's dualism is his most serious intellectual aspect, I am therefore forced to say that what Freud calls reality testing, or even the reality principle, is his version of a kind of Platonism. It's his version of a kind of transcendentalism. It's a value judgment of a particular kind. Very difficult to explain in terms of those preferences. And that, of course, leads to the question of what Freud means by reality. If it's only a 19th century scientism, and alas, to some extent it is, a sort of Helmholtzian physicism, then, of course, it's not very interesting. If it's an idealizing good in itself, it's also not very interesting. Further than that, I cannot take it. Freud on the reality principle is an endless series of problems and not much enlightenment. Freud on the pleasure-pain principle will lead us to discussion, whereas Freud on after all, the ultimate name for the reality principle in Freud, as you undoubtedly can already guess, is thanatos, or death. All that the reality principle can lead to is the death drive. All that the reality principle can lead to is our acceptance of the fact that each of us individually must accept the death of the individual psyche as such. Freud on the pleasure-pain principle is endlessly fascinating, and I am going to, as I say, read to you what seem to me my final notes on this matter. Then I'm going to ask for discussion before we proceed to the whole question of narcissism, because the Freudian question of just what is pleasure and unpleasure is so vast a question begging that I think we'd rather better discuss it pretty fully from the start, even if we get morassed for a while. First of all, it's rather curious that though the technical name of this, finally in Freud, is the pleasure/pain principle, it is almost invariably called pleasure principle even by Freud himself, even in the title of the book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and wants to ask why. Now, if you look at it in terms of using that Freudian lesson on priority, in his earlier writings, it was first called the unpleasure principle. It was purely an economic principle because it defined pleasure. And this is the heart of the matter, and in just a few moments I will ask for discussion about this. What are we to make about a theory, any way of proceeding, which insists, and Freud did this, my dears, from the beginning to the very end of his work. This is Freud from in the 1880s to Freud in 1939. Pleasure is defined as the reduction in the quantity of excitation. Now, I will repeat that. It is so extraordinary a definition but I think one must come to terms with it immediately. Pleasure is defined in a reduction of the quantity of excitation. Pain, therefore, is an increase in the quantity of excitation. Freud never modified this, but it gave him endless trouble, and we will see it giving him trouble a couple of weeks hence at the opening of Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Freud could never really fix the question of this pleasure-unpleasure principle, or this definition of pleasure as a reduction in the quantity of excitation and pain as an increase in the quantity of excitation in regard to the rest of his theory, for two rather crucial reasons. one having to do with the temporality of pleasure and unpleasure, the other having to do with the constancy of pleasure and unpleasure. That is to say, he could not settle temporality as a factor in the pleasure-unpleasure principle. How long did this increase or decrease in the quantity of excitation have to last for it to be defined as either pleasure or unpleasure? He also, that is to say, he could not work out the quantitative difference. He also could never work out the qualitative difference between pleasure and pain. How constant did this quantity of excitation have to be? Which, after all, in the end, is a question about its quality, rather than its... When you speak of the constancy, you're no longer talking about quantity, you're talking about quality. How constant did that have to be for it to be either pleasure or unpleasure? Now, he could not let go, I think, of this as a notion, because of all the Freudian notions, the pleasure-unpleasure principle is absolutely the only one which works for both the conscious and the unconscious agencies and instrumentalities of the psyche. But he also could never work out the relation between the pleasure-pain principle and the constancy principle. And let me phrase that. Should energy be maintained at a constant level or at a minimal level to avoid unpleasure? And I think that's finally what leads to catastrophe theory in Freud and to the question of that it's worked out at the beginning of Beyond the Pleasure principle. But let's talk about that right now. How strange a definition is that anyway? On the basis of your literary, your human, your reading, your philosophic experience, if one begins by defining pleasure or unpleasure in terms of the constancy and temporality of the, as it were, quantity or quality of excitation, meaning that if the quantity or the quality of it is too high, if the pressure of it is too constant, it's unpleasure, and if it is can be reduced or made minimal or be only a short time span, then the release from that tension is pleasure. What kind of persuasive definition of pleasure and pain is that? Let me ask the question historically. Think of Epicureanism, which is the most... Now, Freud was a proud and conscious dualist and materialist, and he professed a great regard for Epicurus and Lucretius, as indeed he should, because historically or classically speaking, they are the greatest instances that we know in human thought and philosophy and poetry of an early materialistic point of view. And indeed, the Freudian account, strangely enough, of the pleasure and unpleasure principles, of the pleasure-pain principle, is utterly consonant with the Epicurean or Lucretian view. That is to say, Epicurus, as you well know, did not say, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. He said, be very moderate, because any increase in the quality or intensity of excitation is really an unpleasure rather than a pleasure, and Lucretius follows him in this throughout the poem. But this leads, of course, to the whole question of the problematic of memory, which will necessarily take us into the Freudian problematics of that which is called Verdrängung or repression, and indeed to the whole question of representation in Freud. According to Epicurus, one should not remember anything unpleasant. Indeed, Epicurus endorses the notion of repression. Anything which is unpleasant should be repressed, should be forgotten. Only pleasant things should be remembered. There could not be, as I remarked, I think, a few weeks ago, in something I wrote in reviewing a rather remarkable book by Yerushalmi on Sakor, or the Jewish concept of memory, there could be no more un-Judaic, and therefore, in a sense, un-Christian notion of memory than the Epicurean notion. But in this respect, at least, Freud is not Judaic, and is certainly not Christian, and is Epicurean, and fits himself to an ancient materialist. But let me hear some observations on this. I mean, the shocker, it seems to me, the thing that one ought to quarrel with from the start, though Freud makes it very difficult to quarrel with him about this, is this whole notion of how you begin by persuasively redefining, in a perfectly Lucretian and Epicurean way, though he does not say so, the whole question of what is pleasurable or unpleasurable. I doubt very much that any of us in our more idealizing moments would define our own sense of what is pleasurable or unpleasurable for us in these Freudian terms. I would think that in our more exhaustive and realistic moments, we might be inclined to endorse what Freud is saying. What might that suggest? Or let me hear some observations about this. Let me repeat, the fundamental Freudian postulates here is that pleasure is a release from excitation. a decrease in excitation, a minimalizing of excitation, whether in the quantitative or in the temporal aspect, particularly in regard to the constancy principle, to the question of what the constancy of excitation is. To have, in short, as little excitation as possible is to be as pleasured as possible. Without this, you could not have the Freudian theory of what he calls the drive or the drives. You could not have the Freudian theory of repression. This is the most fundamental postulate in all of Freud, and if I introduce it rather belatedly after talking about the Freudian therapy in terms of the transference and the Freudian mythology in terms of totem and taboo, there is, I think, some design in that. I know this is difficult to talk about, but I would like to hear, yes, thank you.
When I read that definition, I always thought that excitation was incorrectly translated, maybe. I mean, I just intuitively felt that, and felt that what it referred to was anxiety rather than excitation. In that sense,
But for Freud, there's no such distinction, of course. And therefore, I think Strachey's translation is quite proper. But I think you are making a not unprofound comment about our resistance to these Freudian notions. What would you say your resistance or my own is grounded in, as it were, when we resist such a definition of pleasure or unpleasure as having to do with the constancy, temporality, and indeed quantification of the degree of excitation, insisting always that the minimalizing of excitation is pleasure and the maximizing of it is pain or unpleasure?
to me, the minimizing of excitation is the more we minimize excitation, the closer we get to death.
Well, and that, of course, is the heart of the starting point. That is why Beyond the Pleasure Principle is so profound and disturbing a book. Because Freud starts out from that to the deep and very provoking notion, very provocative notion, very difficult notion to refute, because it has, I think, so strong an effect upon us. It's why it's perhaps, though it's certainly not his greatest text, it is these days his most upsetting text for most of us, perhaps for everybody in this room. That after all, he says we die because we want to die, because we are tired of excitation, because our notion of what one of his disciples, Barbara Lowe, came to call the nirvana principle, or the total zero degree of excitation, is indeed the going back to the origin, which is death. Now, of course, in this there is... What, dear?
Why then did he so embrace life himself and all this?
Well, he certainly embraced, my dear, the explanation of life. But Freud is not a vitalist. I'm asking you to read next week as really your primary reading, which is, and I don't mean next week, it's 2 weeks from today, one of the most depressing books ever written. I do not know a drier, a more anti-pornographic, a book which is going to depress any of us more profoundly than the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. It is as great an achievement as the Traumdeutung, as the interpretation of dreams, perhaps greater. But by the time you have finished reading the book, which is, by the way, an amazing palimpsest, it was written in 1905, 1915, and again in 1925, and you will have to follow the notes in that rather good basic books edition to see the different layers of it. But you will not feel very lustful, I assure you, while you are reading that book or when you reach the end of it. It is a very forbidding book indeed on the whole question of sexual pleasure. Indeed, I would not go... I mean, there's a profound, you might say, not dialectical, but indeed emotional self-contradiction in Freud in this regard. He is perfectly willing to say again and again in his works that the greatest pleasure human beings can know is presumably the height of sexual pleasure, and yet for him truly, and particularly in the 3 essays in the theory of sexuality, the very phrase sexual pleasure is nothing more or less than, rhetorically speaking, an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. Sexuality is as much a bondage, one really feels, for Freud, as it is for the aged Socrates, who in Plato's Laws proclaims how profoundly glad he is finally to be free of the body and its desires. Freud is not unplatonic in that, as in several other regards. But what is one to make of this? I guess I'm asking a question. I don't want to spend too long on this, because I do want us to get into the question of the On Narcissism essay and look at part of that extraordinary text, even before we turn to the question, as I say, of repression and negation, which I'm determined to broach before we part today. In what special sense is Freud loading the dice? Since I have never seen this in any discussion of Freud, whether from an ego-psychological point of view, a Lacanian point of view, any fashionable, any traditional point of view, whether in Rieff or Wollheim or any writer whatsoever, I would like us to talk about this from the start. That is certainly a loading of the dice. When you use those ancient Epicurean dialectics, as I think Freud is doing, as the conscious and proud dualist and materialist that he was, when you begin your entire system, really, with your most basic formulation, by saying that pleasure is far from being a rise in the increase of excitation, it is a stilling, it is a diminishing of the temporality, constancy, and intensity of excitation, what have you done from the beginning? You've done, I think, something profound and very disturbing, and something that I think everyone in this room, and forgive me for presuming upon you, but I think it must be as true of you as it is of me, we both resent this, and yet something in us acquiesces. Perhaps the more vitalistic aspects of us resent this. Those parts of us which are perhaps more in tune with the reality principle finally do accept this, accept the melancholy wisdom of this. That is to say, I take it that the pleasure, unpleasure, or pleasure-pain principle is nothing but the question of sexuality. But Freud addresses it to all mental phenomena whatsoever. And I take it, therefore, that this deep definition of the whole question of pleasure and unpleasure in a way which not only defies what you might call populistic understanding, but describes really what we do not wish to admit, except in our more exhausted and therefore perhaps more realistic moments. But you see the issue that I'm addressing. It is not even literary, let alone philosophical. It is so broad an issue. It is so extraordinary a loading of the dice, or a kind of marking of the cards, that Freud has, I will not say indulged, but insisted upon from the beginning. I really feel that no writer on Freud that I've ever seen has sufficiently addressed herself or himself to this matter. If your redefinition of the whole question of pleasure and pain is to be this persuasive and this intense from the beginning, what would you appear to be driving at? And this is a speculative question on my part. But I do not know a more profound matter in Freud. That is to say, give Freud this from the start, and it does seem to me that he can prove anything. It is like all really powerful and dogmatic systems which deeply address what you might call the mapping of the mind. Thus, if you will grant to Christianity both its rather Hebraic stress on the virtues of the fathers, and I mean Augustinian Christianity, and therefore hence Calvinistic Christianity, if you will grant to it both that and the doctrine of original sin, then you can, of course, finally prove, as Augustine could if he wanted to, that there are purple elephants living on the moon. If you will grant a powerful logical contradiction from the start, then you are enthralled to that system. Now, Freud does have a powerful quasi-logical contradiction of the deepest emotional kind from the start, but he insists upon it. I don't think one wants to quarrel with him about this. I think one wants first to notice it, and secondly, to see what we are giving up when we acquiesce in this from the start. That is to say, when one reads that essay on the two principles of mental functioning, something in us ought to protest and then yield a kind of melancholy assent. But what are we assenting to? Yes?
Is what you're quarreling with?
I'm not quarreling.
Well, the seeming, this sort of splitting of pleasure and pain is the whole principle.
The difference between pleasure and unpleasure, or pleasure and pain, and therefore ultimately pleasure and the reality principle, is only a difference in degree, never a difference in kind. But notice how that difference in degree is worked. If the level of excitation, the intensity of is raised past a certain point upward in the scale, then it's unpleasure rather than pleasure. It's pain rather than pleasure. If the temporality of it is too prolonged, then it's unpleasure rather than pleasure. If the constancy of it, if, as it were, the pressure of it, is too prolonged and too continuous, then it's unpleasure rather than pleasure. What those three elements have in common is a reversal of a pattern that perhaps too easily we might have expected. And that's what I want us still to talk about. And I think you've been very acute in catching that. But let us see what it is that we are giving up. That's what I want dialectically to confront before we look at that moment in Freud where the engine of change, that endless revisionism, really starts going, and that extraordinary rhapsody that he calls on narcissism in 1914. I want to look at that in just a second. What is it that we are giving up? What is it that we are yielding to this great writer and speculator from the stuff?
Could I?
Certainly.
So you have the reality principle and the pleasure principle, and in a way they are the same thing. They're both leading towards Sadomasochism.
Certainly, because if you are saying that unpleasure is excessive excitation, then finally the deepest pleasure, the deepest nirvana, will be the avoidance of all excitation. If the final form of change is death, then to ask for no change is simply to approach death, as Freud will say, by a different detour, by a different delay. Yes. But go on.
Well, then there isn't really a dualism.
Well, that's a very interesting question, which we're going to be looking at in the essay on narcissism. I would have to disagree, because this is the only way in which I am a Freudian. He fought hard for his dualisms. He fought against Jung, he fought against Adler. Had he lived to confront Lacan, he would have fought Lacan. He would have said all of these figures, Derrida, anyone, he would have said that anyone who had ever revised him was trying to take away his dualism, and that was his pride, his conscious and aggressive dualism, his insistence that he was always a dualist, his insistence, in fact, that all dialecticians did away with dualism. This is perhaps the only thing about Freud which is truly philosophical. The only element in Freud which strikes me as being germane to philosophy, and I'm willing to be corrected on this, because I'm not even an amateur in philosophy. I'm all logos. I'm anti-philosophical. I read it only to be repelled by it. I'm part of that ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy, in which one is always repelled by philosophy. But I take it that Freud most truly is philosophical, where he is most anti-philosophical, where he's saying that the dialecticians, including, of course, Hegel, are those who would insist that you can do away with mere dualisms and show that they can always be transcended. His rugged empiricism is his insistence that finally he will insist upon a dualism, that every formulation is dualistic, that every sense of our lives is dualistic, and the deepest dualism in him is between reality and pleasure, unpleasurable, where the pleasurable, unpleasurable is nothing but a double dualism in itself. Now, that is problematic in him. One can dispute it, but it's the loading aspect, or the marking of the cards. It's the way in which he changes the game from the start that fascinates me. Because let me ask you this, what is it that he has cut out for us from the start? I know it's a difficult question, but if you yield from the start, in terms of this definition of pleasure and unpleasure, what have you surrendered, intellectually speaking? I'm not asking what you surrender humanistically or vitalistically. Obviously, you surrender a great deal. If nothing less, you surrender everything that the entire tradition of romantic poetry, yes, the Dionysian element, the Nietzschean element, certainly. You have certainly surrendered all of high romanticism. You've surrendered all of modern vitalism. If you ever look at two remarkable, if crazy books by D.H. Lawrence, The Fantasia of the Unconscious and The Psychology of the Unconscious, you can see that from the start, this is what drives him wild about Freud, that he just cannot accept this notion. And of course, no vitalistic writer could accept it. But Freud is not a vitalistic writer. He is not trying to energize us. He is not trying to vitalize us. He is not trying to liberate us from our repressions. I think we'd better get this straight from the start. It may well be that a great many of his therapists have interpreted him in this way, but this is not what he saw us as doing. He believed that he was trying to reconcile us to reality. He believed finally that he was trying to get us to accept our dying. Not necessarily to fall in love with our dying, but to accept it. Philosophy may or may not be the study of death, which in the Platonic or Socratic sense it is supposed to be. But nowhere does Plato, nowhere does Socrates say that it's the function of the love of wisdom to reconcile to your death. But Freud wishes to do that. He wishes to get you to accept reality testing or the reality principle. I want to know what the price is. And I think it transcends vitalism. It has something to do with his energy models. It has something to do with the whole question of what the economic stance is. It has something to do with his whole question of what narcissism is. Look, this is the transition to narcissism. Let me give it to you by way of a profoundly non-Freudian writer, Ovid, who nevertheless, though Freud never admits it, must have been deeply influential on Freud's concept of narcissism. Any of you have read the Metamorphoses. Can you remember where the story of Narcissus and Echo takes place? Between what two stories? Ovid, who is a very cunning and crafty writer, places it. You've already raised one point, certainly. It takes place between the story of Dionysius and the story of Orpheus being ripped up by the Dionysiac or Maenad or Vassarid women, and the story of Tiresias and Oedipus ultimately. Now, what does that suggest about the legend of Narcissus and the whole concept of the narcissistic in a writer like Ovid? If it is placed between the Dionysiac and the story of Orpheus being rent by the Dionysiac women, the opposition between the Dionysiac and the Orphic, and the destruction of the Orphic on the one side, and the story of Tiresias and his strange change in sexuality and his blinding by having known too much, having known sexuality as both man and woman, and then the passing to the story of Oedipus and his role in the story of Oedipus. Freud, who is immensely shrewd and crafty and a great coverer of his traces, has no references to this in his powerful essay on narcissism, but actually more a rhapsody, I think, than an essay. But what does that suggest in terms of the pleasure-unpleasure principle? In the Ovidian story of Narcissus, there are two basic motifs. Narcissus, as you will remember, falls in love with his own image and thus scorns the love of poor nymph Echo, who just fades away and thus become indeed Echo. Because homosexually, he falls in love with himself. But he reaches two powerful recognitions. One is, and I'm translating this verbatim from Ovid, he says, I both provoke the flames and I suffer the flames. And he also says, and this is even more powerful, my own image no longer deceives me. What does that mean from a Freudian point of view? To say that I both provoke the flames and I suffer the flames, and my image no longer deceives me. Both of them verbatim translations from Ovid's story of Narcissus. And remembering that I've said that Ovid very deliberately places this between the story of Orpheus being rent apart by the Bacchic women and the story of Tiresias and his sexual change, and then the Oedipal story. What does that suggest about the Freudian dialectic of pleasure-unpleasure? And the whole question of the narcissistic ego. This is, I know, difficult. But let us make some attempt at it right at the start. I think this is the heart of what is problematic about Freud, even as he gets at the truth. Let me go back to those Ovidian phrases. To say that I both provoke the flames, I both provoke the burning, and I suffer the burning. And to say my own image no longer deceives me, which means that I'm not really in love, even with myself. Because I know that this is only a self-representation. I have that knowing and sophisticated a concept of narcissism in Ovid already. More knowing and sophisticated even, I would have to say, than what we're about to encounter in the essay on narcissism. It's very disturbing. And then to realize that this is associated with the question of the Dionysiac, the anti-Dionysiac, the destruction of the Orphic, the destruction of the creative by the Dionysiac, and that weird story of Tiresias. Why is Tiresias blinded by Hera? Yeah, he knows too much. Having lived both as man and as woman, in reply to the question by Zeus or Jupiter, do men or women experience more pleasure in the sexual act? Ovid has him reply, women experience far more pleasure. Hera, in anger, blinds him. Zeus or Jupiter then gives him the gift of the oracular or the prophetic, which comes with the blinding, and suddenly you're in the story of this blind sage and Oedipus, who of course finally for his sexual and incestuous trespass and knowingness is going to become blind also. As far as Ovid is concerned, clearly the narcissistic permeates both the story of Tiresias and Oedipus on the one side, and the story of the Dionysiac women and the Orphic on the other. The centerpiece, the heart of the matter, is the narcissistic, defined sophisticatedly as my image no longer deceives me, and I both kindle the flames and endure the flames. That is not very different from Freud. In the light of that, what is Freud doing in these strange and very persuasive redefinitions of pleasure and unpleasure as the absence or presence of excitation, whether in terms of temporality, constancy, or intensity. I think you might begin to see what I'm trying to draw together here before we turn to the question of Freud on narcissism. Yes?
Well, I mean, he's really drawn a solipsistic person. The pleasure and unpleasure really don't function. It's merely self-referential. The other ceases to exist almost.
Not solipsistic for only one reason, and that would be the question of the drive. Since the drive is to be defined in terms of its impetus or origin, in terms of its aim, in terms of its object, in terms of its scope, and since the drive is always for satisfaction by means of or through an object, what resists, and therefore solipsism again is monism, you see. And we are already jumping ahead to what we will be told in the essay, according to the essay on narcissism, which after all I did ask you to read today, the most surprising and marvelous moment from a literary point of view in that extraordinary piece of work. Why, according to that essay, do we fall in love anyway? Because if we did not fall in love, according to that essay, what would happen to us? You could not have missed this, because the most memorable and remarkable moment in an absolutely weird rhapsodic essay. Why do we fall in love? Yes. In the end, he says the ego falls in love because otherwise, in effect, my dear, and the hidden trope is that it would become so full of itself, you would get all blown up and you would burst. In the end, you fall in love. The psychogenesis of love is that you fall in love in order to avoid becoming ill. That is to say, as he says there, and this is in a sense what you're saying, but it dualizes it, you see. Object libido, he says, very grim and powerful sentence, though perhaps when you are unhappy in love, and we are all of us at one time or another very unhappy in love, by definition, almost by Freudian definition, here's the great Freudian formula. Object libido was once ego libido, and can always be converted into ego libido again. Or as I once paraphrased it, a certain degree of narcissistic mobility is rather a good thing. I'm being sardonic, but surely Freud is talking about what is finally in him the therapy of therapies. Because unless I am very weakly misreading the essay on narcissism, and I think I am by now a fairly strong misreader, a perpetual misreader, but always a strong one. I don't think I'm weakly misreading it. Surely that essay is telling us that the therapy of therapies, as far as Freud is concerned, and alas, if only we could do this, is never attach too much libido in this life to any single object, whether it be your child, whether it be your husband or wife, whether it be your father or mother, whether it be your beloved, whether it be your friend, whether it be your work, whether it be your ego idea whatsoever. Do not attach ego libido too thoroughly to any object whatsoever, whether it be human or abstract. Now that is a rather cruel kind of a truth, but I think it lies at the heart of the essay on narcissism. You fall in love in order to avoid becoming ill. And yet, the same essay tells you that the very prototype of the psychosis is the state of being in love. Now that also relates to the condition of Narcissus. I both endure the flames and I provoke or excite the flames. My image no longer deceives me. To say that my image no longer deceives me is to say that object libido has become ego libido again, but somehow one isn't saved by this in the case of Narcissus. And I ask you once more, before I turn to a kind of summary of Freud on narcissism, and perhaps even a quick look at the text together, I want us to move on for a while and see if we can unify at least the links between these notions. There are 5 notions today. The pleasure-unpleasure principle, narcissism, Verdrängung or repression, the whole question of melancholia in relation to mourning, and finally the notion of verneinung or negation. That's a lot to get into one session, but the links are rather clear, if problematic, and I want to see both what is clear and what is problematic in relation to you. But before going now into my own summary of the On Narcissism, the essay. Yes, sir. Oh, the same thing. The same thing. The principle, the pleasure, the principle of pleasure. It's direct verbatim translation. Yeah. The Lustprinzip. Enjoyment. Yeah. Let's say the principle of enjoyment in in the deeper sense. The Unlustlost. Pleasure is a good enough translation because it is a general notion. You wouldn't want to call it lust, which is the cocktails. But satisfaction, really, I think, rather than desire. Desire has to do with drive. Satisfaction has to do with the drive, at least momentarily, being still or accomplished. Now, the question of the drive is very complicated, and I will put that off for a few moments until we talk about repression. But before going on to narcissism, there's still a missing link here. What would you think would be the deepest affinity between making narcissism the engine of change in your theory? And I think this is not a useless observation on my part. Freud was a perpetual self-revisionist. The secret to his work is the way in which he is always revising his own earlier notions. He could not abide in his notions. He could not bear it if anybody else challenged them. But he himself could not bear his own notions. Now that is, of course, a general human characteristic, but more powerful in Freud than in any writer or any person otherwise on record. These notions were quite dogmatic in regard to others, but in regard to himself there was perpetually the necessity for revision. And insofar as his own notions became part of anteriority, they always entered the agon for him. There's no question that the engine of change, the mechanism of change in Freud, the principle that always makes for change in Freud, is the concept of narcissism. That's what always driving him on. He always goes from work to work by returning to the problematic of narcissism. But narcissism in turn for Freud, and in this he is quite Ovidian, relates to the question of how you define pleasure or pain. If you say, and I return to this now for the last time, those two remarkable moments in the story of Narcissus and Ovid, if you say that my image no longer deceives me, and you simultaneously say, I both stimulate or provoke the flames and I endure the flames, what is your attitude towards pleasure and towards pain?
It's ambivalent.
It's deep, it's enormous, a primal ambivalence. But let us ask now, what is ambivalence, whether in Freud or in the great poets, including Ovid and Spencer and Milton and Shakespeare and Homer and so on? Because I think we'd better be clear about this from the start, because ambivalence has a general or popular meaning, and has a stricter both poetic and Freudian meaning. Ambivalence, whether in Freud or the great poets, does not mean both liking and disliking the same person or phenomenon, or loving and hating the same person or phenomenon. It means the simultaneous. It doesn't mean a sequential, now I hate you, now I love you, as in Catullus. No. It's not odi et amo. No. It means that at one and the same time, in absolute simultaneity, in absolute self-contradiction, in a kind of dualistic bewilderment, I resent and fear you, and yet I like and admire you. I lust after you, and yet I repel the image of you. It means I am deceived by my own image, and my image no longer deceives me. It means I provoke the flames, I stimulate the flames, and I endure, I suffer from the flames. Now, narcissism is, from the start in Freud, as it is in Ovid, a primally ambivalent notion. And before leaving the pleasure-unpleasure definitions, how ambivalent are they? How ambivalent is Freud towards pleasure? I want to ask how ambivalent he is towards pain, because nobody wants pain. Towards pain we do not feel ambivalence unless we are masochistic. And Freud is healthy. He is not a masochist. Whether or not we are is another story. But what about the definition of pleasure in Freud? Surely there is a deep ambivalence towards pleasure. If you define pleasure as an absence or reduction in the quantity, constancy, or temporal flow of excitation. And that there is a deep, a moralistic, I think one would have to say, if not a puritanical, in some sense, some traditional kind of ambivalence towards pleasure in Freud. That at one and the same time he wishes to release us from our ambivalence towards pleasure, and yet cannot quite bear to do so, then I think one has caught something in him which, alas, is imperishable. But now I do want to take us on to the whole question of narcissism and essay, and I am going to begin with a kind of summary of it, because I think one simply has to deal with this from the start. let me fill in some of the background. I don't want to take too long on this because I want to get us to the technical points of repression and negation, but I want to work us very quickly through on narcissism, mourning, and melancholia, and then see if we can have some discussion. First of all, let me locate this in time. Freud had originally thought in 1914 that his theory was complete when he went to Rome, by the way, with his sister-in-law, Mina. The biographers are not going to agree about this for some time, partly because the executives of Anna Freud are sitting on the letters. But in spite of Ernest Jones's denial and the late Anna Freud's denial and so on, I'm afraid, I don't know why I'm afraid, this is another Freudian sign, the evidence is fairly unequivocal. After he was 40 years old, Freud no longer, as it were, made love. I don't know why I say as it were. There also is an anxiety on my part. Freud evidently ceased to make love to Madame Freud, and in a grand biblical style, transferred his sexual attentions to his sister-in-law, Minna. It must have been with the knowledge and consent of Madame Freud. It must have been a well-kept family secret. In any case, it was during a vacation in Rome in 1914 with Minna that Freud, in some sort of state of great happiness, wrote the first of the two really rhapsodic and intense texts that he wrote, and that is On Narcissism, an Introduction. The other is the extraordinary text of 5.5 years later, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Now, he himself had thought before he wrote On Narcissism, which is, as I think you realize in reading it, an extraordinary essay. It's an essay which is always starting and stopping and stopping and starting again. So he doesn't quite realize what he is doing. Narcissism changed his sense of the libido. He came to understand suddenly that all libido came from the narcissistic passion. Whether this was or was not autobiographical in its origins, I leave to surmise. There's no question that argumentatively, or as I would say agnostically, it is the contest with Jung and with Adler, both of whom are recent heretics, which is the spur for this major transformation in Freud's theory of the ego. And I want to make that clear because I'm not asking you to read any earlier formulations of Freud on the ego. The earlier Freudian ego was an ego involving the repression of the drive. That is to say, it was a kind of Virgilian logos. Earlier, there had been a kind of conflict of drives, the ego drive against the sexual drive, as though the ego is Aeneas and the sexual drive is, say, Dido of Carthage. But you have a much more Ovidian ego with the narcissistic kind of an ego. The narcissistic ego, the ego of the essay on narcissism, is not an agent which is directed against the sexual drive. In fact, you have moved out of the world of the drive in the essay on narcissism, and you've moved into a world of wish or desire. And so at this point, one has to ask, what is a drive in Freud? And I want to talk about that for a few moments. And of course, at this point, one is in the problem of all really dualistic writers. You cannot define any entity without reliance upon a previous persuasive definition of another entity, so that Freud, like Blake, is a writer whom you can break into only by violence. You have got to state a formulation in terms of prior formulations, but you are always caught in circularity, and this makes for irritation on both your part and mine from the start. The Freudian notion of drive, usually translated for very complex and defensible reasons as instinct, because of the history of the English language by Strachey, is treiben, which means to push. So a drive suggests strong pressure. Now, an instinct in Freud or in English is a kind of hereditary pattern of behavior of animals. An instinct moves temporally, let us say in temporality, it's purposive, it doesn't easily yield to change. What Freud means by a drive, which is usually translated, I repeat, perhaps unfortunately, I don't know instinct, as in the very title of Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, part of next week's reading on the origins of the theory of Sadomasochism. A drive is a dynamic in which a pressure of energy pushes a person towards any goal or aim. And this is peculiar about Freud. A Freudian drive always has its origin in a bodily urge or stimulus. This bodily urge or stimulus produces tension. The aim of that drive is to get rid of this tension, whether in or by the object of the drive. So you really have a rather curious kind of a metaphor here. And now I turn specifically to the question of narcissism. In 1910, 4 years before the essay that I've asked you to read, Freud used the term narcissism for the first time in order to account for homosexuals, and he was clearly thinking of the Ovidian account of Narcissus, those who, as he says, and I'm quoting him, take themselves as their own sexual object, That is to say, they look for a narcissistic basis. It's a very profound remark. I don't know that anyone, and I know this is resented these days, but I don't know that any account of the origins of human homosexuality, female or male, is as powerfully persuasive as this. Homosexuals, Freud says, take themselves as their sexual object. That is to say, they proceed from a narcissistic basis, and they look for a young man or a young woman who resembles themselves and whom they may love as their mother loved them, and whom they may love as their mother loved them. That nurturing element in all homosexual relations, which Freud endlessly dwells upon. You may want to disagree with this, you may feel polemical about this, or feel that there is a barely concealed polemic in what he is saying, but that there is some kind of Einsicht or insight in this seems to me disputable. Notice that this is a stage in between, a transitional stage, between what you could call autoeroticism and object love. That there's a wavering balance here between ego libido, that is to say, love invested in one's own ego or self-preservation, and object love. So that in some sense from the start, and this I'm afraid is Bloom, rather than any Freudian commentator before me, what Freud calls narcissism is a kind of damming up of the libido, which no object love could ever possibly hope to overcome. The best instance of it that I know of in a poem in the English language is the great poem Mariana by the early Tennyson. Interesting Freudian slip there, which I will slip away from immediately. Where you remember Mariana keeps saying of her lover, he cometh not, she said, but it's perfectly clear that whether he were ever to come in any sense of coming, it wouldn't make the slightest bit of difference, because nothing ever is going to overcome that deep narcissistic damming up of libido, which is working in the heroine of that rather extraordinary, narcissistic, and self-regarding poem. By the way, as I understand Lacan, this is how Lacan got his start, because it's at just this moment in Freud, in the essay on narcissism, with this rather profound notion of a damming up of libido that no object love can overcome, that Lacan took his start, because that's where he injected his mirror stage or phase, where the ego is so captivated by its own bodily image that it takes its proper start as an independent entity. Freud himself slid over that, and he slid over that for rather crucial reasons, and I think they had to do with his dualism. That is to say, Freud wanted an absolute dualism, and this is his absolute dualism, finally, and I state it now. Opposing, this is my language rather than his, but I think it's accurate, Freud's ultimate, his absolute dualism after 1920, after Beyond the Pleasure Principle in his mature work, opposes a primary narcissism, which is absolutely prior and therefore always objectless, to all object relations whatsoever. Now that, of course, is indeed to talk about a conflict between solipsism and otherness, as you yourself suggested earlier. But that, I think, is the deepest of all the Freudian dualisms. Primary narcissism, always prior, always objectless, against all object relations whatsoever. That is to say, you can say that in primary narcissism, you do have a kind of pure solipsism. The ego and the id are wholly one, whether as before birth, or in the deep sleep of a baby, when we at least like to believe that a baby is not sleeping. Narcissism that comes with ego formation, through identification with another person, Freud will henceforth call secondary narcissism, a less important mode of narcissism. And he gives three reasons for this, to which I want to enter some objections. And this will go back to this question of the pleasure-unpleasure principle. First, Freud says we ought to talk of a secondary narcissism, ego formation through identification with another person, because the it or id has now been made a separate instance or agency. Secondly, because the ego's capacity for adaptation as well as identification is now being taken into account. And thirdly, because autoeroticism and narcissism blend together in what he calls secondary narcissism. There are two objections I would make, which I've been trying to get all sorts of Freudians of all schools to answer, but I can't get them to answer. One, it is a fact, surely, that even a newborn babe is anything but a pure solipsist. Freud did not want to believe that. It was absolutely crucial to his theory that a newborn baby be a pure solipsist. But all of the work of the last 25 years by more objective and empirical psychologists shows that this is not the case, that a newborn babe is anything but that. Secondly, though Freud insisted that his notion of secondary narcissism would give you a dualistic dyad, I'm afraid this is still a monad. That you cannot find much distinction in this from the question of primary narcissism. That is to say, secondary narcissism doesn't really work in Freud. Primary narcissism is so strong that in its opposition to all object relations, it precipitates that problematic which the essay on Mourning and Melancholia takes up. I want to talk about that essay and then open this whole question of narcissism to a discussion before we go on to Repression and Negation. And I want now to give a commentary on the essay Mourning and Melancholia that you read for today, first by paying it a great compliment. I do not know a more profound essay on grief, whether it be, and I mean in any language that I'm able to read by any writer I've ever read, than Freud's Mourning and Melancholia. It is an extraordinary essay, as you surely realize in reading it for today. You also realize surely from the start what always puzzles me, that it looks as though it is at first an essay on the loss of the loved object, which is talking about the grief for the dead. But the more deeply you read it, the more you discover that Freud has played a trick both on himself and you, and the object loss involved is by no means necessarily the death, but is the loss of love, or the return of love. It's the loss of the erotic object which is concerned, so that even the death of the parent is being treated as the loss of the erotic object. That is to say, the dominant element in the essay, the dominant trope, is that what is being mourned as though it is death is merely the death of oneself in relation to that person's consciousness, and therefore a narcissistic loss, which is what connects it to the essay on narcissism. Therefore, I would call Mourning and Melancholia an essay on the difficulties of detachment from the loved object. And I remind you again that object in this sense, and this is a very important point in these days of quite proper and justifiable feminism, where, however, there's frequently, I think, a kind of ignorant attack on Freud, thinking that by the object he always somehow means the woman, rather than the man. Object in Freud does not mean the objectification or corporalization of any person, female or male, into a body. When Freud uses the word object, he means the aim or the goal of a drive. He does not mean the reduction of a human being to object status. He simply means the aim or the goal of a drive, whether the object is male or female. It means an erotic object in the sense that objectification is the aim or goal through or by which a drive will satisfy itself. Now, he himself, in a very powerful phrase, which I can never forget, says that this is an essay upon what he calls tropologically the work of mourning. And I want us to talk about that later in terms of the pleasure-unpleasure principle, because I think it's another clue to the way Freud loads the dice or changes the deck from the beginning. The work of mourning. The work of mourning. M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. That is to say, the psyche is working through or working out, according to Freud, when it has to address the whole question of erotic mourning or loss, is a way of freeing itself from trauma by binding traumatic impressions. And I'm only now summarizing the essay that you read with a view towards bringing us to discussion in relation to the problematics both of narcissism and of pleasure-unpleasure principle. Freud calls the pathological opposite of a healthy work of mourning a work of reproduction. The work of mourning, therefore, ceases to reproduce. The work of pathology reproduces or repeats. In the work of mourning, according to Freud, all interest in the external world falls away. You can think of this in terms of your own erotic mourning, until the ego is confronted by the possibility of sharing in the doom of the lost object. When the ego is confronted by that possibility, it becomes persuaded, Freud says, and here I quote the Strachey translation, by the sum of the narcissistic blisses of life, finally to cut itself off irreparably and even without nostalgia from the lost object. And then writing very powerfully, and I think Strachey catches this, Freud says, the work of mourning kills death. Marvelous trope. The work of mourning kills death by detaching the libido from the lost object and so withdrawing its economic investment, its cathexis or besetzung. And then Freud gives one a scale, and I want to consider this scale in relation now both to narcissism and to pleasure-unpleasure, and here surely we can discuss matters before going on to the deeper problematic of repression and negation. According to Freud, all mourning is a triple scale. Normal mourning, which is the work of mourning, where first you go through this deep alienation from an object world until you realize that you're going to share, your own ego will share the doom of the lost object, so you cut yourself off from that lost object out of proper and healthy narcissism. So normal mourning is first on this scale. Then comes what Freud calls pathological mourning, which is nothing but ambivalence and aggressivity. In fact, the pathological mourning comes, he says, from the fact that your deep ambivalence, your desire for continued aggressivity against the lost object, has not yet been satisfied. And third and deepest, and this is psychosis, on the scale of mourning, is strangely enough the most narcissistic element. And here's where the dialectic, I think, gets most difficult. Because what is most narcissistic? Freud says that the sum of the narcissistic blessings of life finally is enough to make you, in normal mourning, cut yourself off from the lost object and reassert your own ego, and thus perform the work of mourning. And pathological mourning, aggressivity and ambivalence takes over, and you get neurosis, that in melancholia, or pathological or psychotic mourning, he says, there is a narcissistic identification with the lost object, which is so great that you feel that, alas, you yourself are gone. Now, that there is in that a powerful and persuasive Freudian split, because normal mourning is the height of narcissism on the one hand, and the third, as it were, degree of this, pathological mourning, where you have total identification with the lost object, is narcissistic mourning also. So that both the first and the third degrees are intensely narcissistic, but the second degree, neurotic mourning, marked by aggressivity and ambivalence, is somehow less narcissistic than the other two, is a puzzle that no commentator on Freud, whether empirical like Volheim, or sociological Reef, both of whom are admirable writers, or Lacanian and Derridaean like Laplanche and so forth, have been able to explain at all. And I think that puzzle has to do with the whole problematic of the pleasure-unpleasure principle. And so, though I will put a time limit on this discussion, let's give ourselves 15 or 20 minutes on this before I go on to expound the whole question of the Verdrängung and the Verneinung of repression and negation, and what is most difficult and peculiar about that in Freud. But let's talk about this. What do you make of this? Let's start with this rather peculiar puzzle. And after all, consult your own experience. We have all lost loved ones, whether because they have abandoned us, we are objects that they no longer care for, or because they are dead and gone. Either we are dead to them, or they are actually dead. Now think of those three, and that's a profound analysis of mourning. I know of nothing like it in the whole history, the whole question of grief and mourning. And this is Freud's great power in the end. I think Freud's great power in the end is that he takes the great commonplaces, and far more even than Montaigne or Plato, perhaps more, even than Shakespeare, though this worried him, I think, which is why he tried to persuade himself in the last phase not only that Moses was an Egyptian, but Shakespeare was the Earl of Oxford. And he started worrying about his ultimate cultural rivals, perhaps too much. Yet, to theorize on a question like jealousy, I mean, if you and I want to think as human beings about jealousy, or if we want to think about different degrees of mourning, or if we want to think, after all, about different degrees of object attachment, why we fall in love at all, or why we fall in love with one person rather than another, Freud is the most interesting and persuasive speculator and theorizer about these altogether mundane and altogether inescapable matters. And that, I think, is what perhaps I should have said a week ago, when towards the end, with cracked voice, I was trying to answer your point of why, after all, Freud is inescapable. We do not have, it seems to me, in the whole of Western tradition, any other writer who has so courageously and tenaciously addressed himself to the most universal and mundane of questions. Well, look at this universal and mundane question. Whether one is speaking of lost love or lost parents. 3 degrees of mourning. The work of mourning or normal mourning, pathological, abnormal, neurotic mourning, marked by ambivalence and aggressivity, in which he says truly what you feel is that you cannot give up your grief because you're still so angry, and there's an aggressivity and an ambivalence, a love-hate relation that you've never worked out against its object before either it abandoned you or it died. Object as aim or object as drive, I remind you again. And finally, mad mourning, as it were, pathological mourning, psychotic mourning, melancholia, in which narcissistic identification with what is gone is so great that you are already dead. You are one of the dead. What's curious about that? What happens to the pleasure-unpleasure principle? Well, what happens indeed to the concept of narcissism? I think Freud's greatest power is that all these concepts flow into one another finally, that they cannot really be distinguished from one another, that it is so problematic to really separate them from one another. Yeah.
Well, it seems like, in terms of this pain and pleasure split, that to the extent that Freud said that you can't ever separate from anything, the act of separation implies an identification. That's sort of almost given. That this normal mourning is, in a way, you're identifying with something positive in the dead, departed. You identified with something positive. The other is almost identifying with the pain that has died.
Well, I think you are trying to save him from his dilemma, and you are being very shrewd. I don't know that he himself says that. I mean, that would be an extremely rational way of solving this problem. Why one mode of narcissism in stage 1 of mourning should be healthy and normal, as it were, and another mode of narcissism in the third stage should be unhealthy and psychotic, by making it a question of positive and negative, but that the middle phase should be both positive and negative simultaneously, marked by that ambivalence which pragmatically is always an aggressivity towards the object, and therefore by the whole question of the dualism of sadism and masochism, which in Freud is nothing but activity and passivity. As we will be seeing, 2 weeks hence, Freud will not distinguish finally between sadism and masochism. He will begin with the notion that sadism is primary and prior, and masochism modifies it. He will end with a more profound notion, as you will see, as he works through from vicissitudes of the drive, which really means the defenses of the drive or the instinct, through to a child who's being beaten, and the whole question of the need for punishment, and finally the profound notion of what he calls moral masochism, or what he insists is the unconscious and narcissistic sense of guilt. In the extraordinary essay called The Economic Problem of Masochism, he will say in effect that passivity is fundamental and prior, and only secondarily are we active and aggressive. You see, our ambivalence is in the first place is primal, but in the first place he will finally insist its true priority is always passive rather than active. Sexually, we are all of us more passive than active, is what he insists. We would all prefer, I think this is the ultimate Freudian insight on this, we would all prefer to be objects of the drive rather than active agents of the drive. Whether you find that convincing or not, whether literature does or does not bear that out, is problematic. I am not myself prepared to say. I think, you've made a very gallant effort to rescue him there, but it's not what he himself is saying in Mourning and Melancholia. And so it returns on, I think, both to the problematic of narcissism. Look, let me restate the problematic of narcissism. He wants to distinguish primary from secondary narcissism. But as I've indicated already, his account of secondary narcissism is very faulty, and his account of primary narcissism is all too convincing. And it's very difficult, finally, to quarrel with his account of primary narcissism, because it is the essential agent, the engine of change, as I say, and stands against all object relations whatsoever. Basic dualism in Freud finally is ego libido against object libido. I would like to be wrong, but I think I'm not. That the increase in excitation always comes with object libido. The decrease in excitation, which leads, alas, to pleasure, according to Freud, always comes with ego libido. Comes with the return of the libido to itself. If the therapy of therapies, then, is not to have too strong an investment in any object whatsoever, then you come back to the irony of narcissism, which is still the ego must get out of itself, because otherwise it will get sick. An excess of self-love will make it ill. Why? Why? And this one is deeply involved in what is problematic about the essay Mourning and Melancholia. Of those 3 phases or stages of mourning, normal mourning or the work of mourning, pathological mourning marked by ambivalence and aggressivity towards the supposedly loved object or the wholly loved object, and psychotic mourning or melancholia, in which there's total narcissistic identification with the lost object. Which of those three is most narcissistic? Which is closest to the ego's investment in itself? Which I'm afraid here I do agree probably with the Lacanians. So far as I can see, the ego psychologists from Heinz Hartmann on have performed a kind of weak misreading of what is most powerful in the essay on narcissism. The deepest implication, beyond a doubt, of the essay on narcissism is that the ego is constituted by the self's investment in itself. Something prior to the ego, something prior to the if, to the I. Some kind of coagulation of self, you can really be tropological about this, some kind of eddying current of libido, so invests in itself as to constitute an otherwise unconstituted entity, which in turn becomes the ego. So that the ego is itself a product of the narcissistic invention or investment, even the possession of the self in the self. Without the narcissistic passion, there is no ego. The human implications of that are, of course, devastating. And one sees why we want to resist them. But as students of literature, one also sees why the Lacanians are not unpersuasive. And why perhaps Lacanianism is more a mode of literary theory from the start than it is a mode of psychoanalytic theory. Certainly, the ego of the lyric poet, the I of the lyric poet throughout Western history, from Pindar through Callimachus to the present, is, in a sense, that kind of paranoid construct, inevitable. But I go back to those 3 degrees of mourning. Did somebody get the door so we don't have the outside noise? Yeah, it is the first one, sure. It is the first one. That is to say, there's something wrong with the work of mourning, as Freud talks about it. Now, what is problematic about that in terms of the theory of narcissism? After all, the theory of narcissism, the essay on narcissism, is written before Mourning and Melancholia. Mourning and Melancholia is a kind of great coda or pendant, which dangles from the end of the essay on narcissism. Now, what is problematic about the work of mourning? Freud insists that because it is healthy, it abandons the object world for a while, and then it suddenly realizes in a kind of shudder of terror that all narcissistic satisfactions may be gone for good, and so it recoils and it accepts the death or loss of the object, and perhaps more bitterly accepts the fact that something in the self is now dead, has been killed by the loved object, which has abandoned oneself as object, by the loved subject, you might say, which has abandoned one as object. Can that be wholly distinguished from the third phase? That is to say, was Freud right in talking about 3 stages? Is not the real split between a strange alliance between 2 varieties of the narcissistic passion? The work of mourning and melancholia on the one side, and pathological mourning marked by ambivalence and aggressivity on the other? I think this is going to go back to what is problematic about the pleasure-unpleasure principle. I know this is difficult, but I feel it is better to address these difficulties from the start and not to evade them, because I don't think one can have a clear account of what really matters about any notion of repression or any notion of negation until one has worked this out. So this may become clear at, say, 15 or 20 minutes hence. But stay with me for a while on this. If the narcissistic passion is what matters, that is to say, if the deepest dualism in Freud is the opposition between narcissistic self-possession, self-investment, self-cathexis, and any object relation whatsoever, then how can you distinguish the supposed first and the supposed third phase of mourning? You can certainly distinguish both from the second phase, because ambivalence or aggressivity towards the self is the entire problematic of sadomasochism, and that is a very different question from mourning. It is a peculiarity of sadomasochism that it has nothing to do with mourning, strangely enough. What does one mean by that? The sadomasochistic passion in any of its forms has very little to do with mourning, very little to do with remorse, very little to do with a sense of loss. It is marked by acute aggressivity and ambivalence. But those other two phases, so-called normal mourning, so beautifully called the work of mourning by Freud, and that deep narcissistic identification with what has been lost, or the feeling that what truly has been lost is oneself, they are not so easy to distinguish as Freud thought. Yes?
I'm trying to remember, at some point in time, did Freud not say that the amount of energy within the libido that could be placed around is finite?
Yes, very finite indeed.
So
whereas the amount of energy that could be invested in the self so as to produce the ego was quite infinite. And of that he's always clear also. Go on.
Within self?
Yes. Oh, it says you can always dam it up, you see. And by damming it up, you can increase.
But if there's a certain finite amount of energy which can be placed on an object, if when a loved person, an object is lost,
But what is that energy?
would that not turn back upon itself so that it's finite? You could no longer place it. If you have to, therefore you would have to.
But what does Freud mean by libido or energy? Which is, I assure you, a wholly mythological and non-biological construct. What does he mean by it? He depends upon it from the start. This is the theory of the drive. But what does he mean by it? He always insisted that it could be quantified, that it was measurable. But of course it isn't measurable. Biologists to this day assure us, and Freud couldn't stand being assured of this, but it always has been true and always will be true. It simply is a physical truth. There is no such thing, my dears, as a purely sexual energy. Freud had to believe that there was. That was his mythology, as he finally grimly admitted in the operas, in the outline of psychoanalysis that he writes in 1938, where he almost defiantly says the theory of the drives is, so to speak, our mythology, meaning myself, the royal we, psychoanalysis. Drives, he says, are magnificent conceptions, particularly magnificent in their indefiniteness. I mean, the irony of that is overwhelming. It's almost killing in what it does to the reader. There's no quantifiable libido. You and I do not have a sexual energy which stands apart from other degrees of energy. When we are, and Freud knew this anyway, he's always saying, he says it in the essay on Narcissism. He says it when he quotes the comic rhymes to Wilhelm Busch. The poet stops being in love when he has a toothache. Is clearly an indication of that.
Didn't he say sexual energy, the libido was everything, was all energy?
No, he can't do that. No, he rejects that. That's what he accuses others of. That's what he accuses his heretics of.
I had thought he said that.
No, my dear, no, because then you would not have dualism anymore. Then you would have a monistic single drive. He starts with the notion that there are two drives, self-preservation of the ego and the libido. He ends with the notion that there are two drives, the libido and thanatos, the death drive. And I would tell you an anecdote which I may have told you before because it never ceases to fascinate me. Ernest Jones records, and I've seen the manuscript, for about 20 minutes in the year 1920, Freud actually, and I know when I talked to you about this, when I talked about the whole question of facticity, for about 20 minutes as Freud doodled away, he was on the verge, so help me, of inventing a mad, ghastly concept called destrudo. D-E-S-T-R-U-D-O, which would have been the negative version of libido. And the notion would have been that eros is fueled by libido, but that thanatos is fueled by destrudo. He thought it over, and after 20 minutes he rejected it. But I assure you that if he hadn't rejected it, then it would be part of your everyday vocabulary and mine. We would be stuck with it the way we are stuck with libido. Well, look, my dears, there is no destrudo, and there is no libido. But because Freud had to have a notion of libido, so we have it also. He had to believe that there was one energy which fueled the two drives, but that energy in itself was ambivalent, was set against itself, and was a dualizing kind of energy from the start. If there weren't one energy, you couldn't have the economic perspective or the economic theory.
So there was that one.
Yeah, it is a one energy, but it is always set against itself, and it always is viewed from the economic perspective, which means it's got to be quantifiable, and it's always viewed as dearth rather than excess, which leads one back to the pleasure-unpleasure principle again. Now, I want to cross over from this, in just a short time, to the whole question of the theory of the Verdrängung, the very difficult notion of repression, which is not, by the way, a pushing under or a pushing, down. I have no quarrel, unlike the idiot Bettelheim, forgive me, but I'm more and more impatient, with him. No quarrel with Strachey's translation of Verdrängung as repression. I don't know the English word that should have been used. Unfortunately, because of Marcuse and what happened in the late 60s and so on, repression now has a rather political meaning for us, which it didn't have for Strachey. Verdrängung is an almost impossible term to translate. It really means what in English, had Strachey gone into one of his Latinisms, we call the apotropaire, warding off, defending against, what Freud calls Abwehr, and originally Verdrängung and Abwehr were a synonym in Freud, though as he developed the notion, particularly in the great essay on the Verneinung of negation, of the non-repressive defenses, particularly introjection and projection, the two ceased to be a synonym. But that's a story which we could put off for a while also. But I want to proceed to this sort of by a halfway measure now by asking, what is there in common between the sort of similar kind of problematic or series of problematics that we've been looking at so far today and the difficulty of a concept of repression? But remember, repression doesn't mean pushing down or pushing under, but always has in Freud the characteristic trope of flight, fleeing away from something, running away from something, avoiding it, warding it off, defending against it, getting it out of sight, getting it out of consciousness. And where the strangest part of it is, and in the end Freud is going to insist, and it's already implicit in the essay on the Verdrängung, which I asked you to read for today, almost explicit in fact, that it takes place in a primal way. It is or. It is original. That what is repressed or avoided or what you are in flight from, and by the way, remember, it is never the thing in itself. It's always an image or a memory or a desire. That is to say, it's always a representation. It's always a representation of something that the drive would wish to be gratified by, but which something else feels the drive should not be gratified by. And this wish, this memory, this image, this desire, according to Freud, comes into being before it can come into being. Repression takes place before there is anything to repress. You start fleeing before there's anything to flee from. You have, as it were, a fundamental postulate in your existence or your being, which is that you are in flight before you even know what you are fleeing from. It's almost Wordsworthian. It's Wordsworth's theology of the unconscious, as in Tintern Abbey. More like a man fleeing from something that he dreads than seeking something which he loves. Yes?
It's not the same, this primal repression seems to be the same thing as this primal narcissistic formation.
Well, there is a relation between all these primals in Freud, and that's indeed what I want to get at. Go on.
Well, one thing I was going to say earlier, there's sort of a contradiction, fundamental contradiction in this idea of there being a narcissistic state prior to an object state, because to posit narcissism already posits an object. It's just like you're splitting. If there isn't an object, if it's an objectless state, there's merging, and so it's as much pure object.
Sure. But the last thing, as you probably know, that Freud was ever to write, and I'll ask you to read it in a few weeks' time, is the famous Ego-Spaltung, the last unfinished brief essay, the splitting of the ego in the process of defense, which again is prior to anything else. That is to say, even before the ego is formed, it splits. So another of these strange formulations of Freud that at the primal base of things, the primal of all primals in Freud, I take it finally, is ambivalence itself. You cannot have a more primal entity in Freud or in any other writer than ambivalence, and he will say so finally, and he will say it's because of the two drives. He will say the two drives may originally have been one. They may have had a monistic, narcissistic basis, but they were improperly fused. Why, he does not know. And what he calls in the English translation with a slash mark in between, the fusion-diffusion of the primary drives produces a primal ambivalence in every one of us, which we feel both towards ourselves and towards any possible object for ourselves. And again, one goes back to the fundamental postulate of the distinction between a reality and a pleasure principle. But one question I didn't ask at the start today, I want to ask now. What's the special kind of, again, ruining the gamble or changing the stakes from the beginning, or running the game, loading it in favor of the house, which in this case is Freud himself, when you distinguish between a reality and a pleasure principle? What is the tropological implication? What is the metaphoric implication when you say that reality stands on one side and pleasure on the other?
Reality.
Yeah, but watch this, my dear. Watch. No, this is much more complicated because pleasure is unpleasant, after all. The reality principle is on one side. No, Freud is terribly subtle about this. The reality principle is on one side of this dualism. The pleasure-unpleasure principle, which alternatively can be called either the pleasure principle or the unpleasure principle. And the truth is that of his three names for the same principle, unpleasure principle, pleasure principle, and pleasure/mark pleasure principle, there's no doubt that the most accurate one, tropologically and descriptively, is the unpleasure principle. The pleasure principle is really an unpleasure principle. So that famous title should have been not beyond the pleasure principle, but beyond the unpleasure principle, beyond any question. So that the real distinction from the start is between reality on the one side and the whole, as it were, mere dialect. The dualism is between reality and pleasure or unpleasure. That is to say, there's no real difference between pleasure or unpleasure compared to reality. What does that mean? What have you done when you've loaded it in that way? Because I think this may be one clue to all of these primals in Freud. And one reason why, finally, the whole concept of Verdrängung or repression has to be modified by that crucial notion of Freudian negation, which I insist I'm going to get onto before we part later on today. But we must stay with this for a while. I'm going to talk about repression in a moment and, use material that I've brought on it. But I want to talk about this a little bit further first, because there is something very bothersome about this. Look, let me resort to some of the material for a moment, because it may help discussion to get started. Here, look, I will try to define repression. I will try to state what the problems are involved with it, and then let's see if we can get this back to this rather extraordinary dualism between reality on the one side, pleasure and unpleasure on the other. Repression, and for a while I'm going to be very strict, it's pure Freud. Repression is a mode of defense in which the subject tries to fend off, apotropeically, ward off, or keep in the unconscious Vorstellungen, which we can only translate in English as representations that are attached to a drive. Not the drive itself, but representations that are attached to it. If yielding to the drive, however pleasurable/mark unpleasurable, if yielding to the drive, however pleasurable or unpleasurable, would provoke other unpleasures, greater unpleasures, precisely because of that dialectic of pleasure and unpleasure in Freud, then repression, then warding off or flight takes place, and images, memories, thoughts that are associated with the drive are repelled. Now watch that. The representations are images, memories, and thoughts. Now that's pretty comprehensive. How much do you and I encounter, whether in what we read or what we write, or what courses through our consciousness, how much is there in us which is neither image nor memory nor thought? What else really can there be? What are we fed by play of representations? Now, Freud began by believing that repression, Verdrängung, was peculiarly, absolutely revealed in hysteria. But he also thought that it was the universal mode of defense because it constituted, or as I would say, it heaps up, what he calls the unconscious. But then there are two provisos that I want to make from the start. One, consciousness is not the agency of repression. That's something that all of us, no matter how, I do it all the time. I always forget that. That's almost the hardest single thing I know in reading Freud or thinking about Freud. You keep thinking that consciousness must be the agency of repression, but it isn't. Repression is always a defensive operation of the ego And the ego, according to the mature Freud, from the essay on narcissism on, is largely unconscious. So therefore, consciousness is not the agency of repression, and it isn't even the conscious element in the ego, which is the agency of repression. And that is why, of course, you have to have a notion of primal repression, why it has to be an unconscious kind of operation. But then there's an even more profound problematic, and this bothers me a great deal. And this will go back to this question of pleasure, unpleasure, and perhaps I'm being a little too primal today, but this bothers me so much that I want to worry it, like a dog with his bone. What are the motives for repression? Why do we repress? Why do we ward off? Why are we always in flight? According to Freud himself, he never explains. And I have ransacked him looking for the explanation. And I will give some possible explanations that he suggests. But let me pose the question very plainly, and this is me rather than Freud. If the drive in the first place is defined, as Freud does define it, as that which yields pleasure when it is fulfilled or satisfied, what is it that sets off by displeasure the defense of repression? Now, Freud never gave a single clear answer to that, and I can think of 3 answers that you might set forth on the basis of his work. One is that you can say that the drive itself can be regarded by any ego as a kind of internal danger. That is to say, the fear of pleasure is like the fear of futurity. That would make the ego rather like Blake's Urizen, by the way, in the book of Urizen. I don't know whether that is a Freudian explanation, but still it is a possible one. Secondly, you can say that the fulfillment of the drive might expose the ego to dangers from the outside world. That would be Philip Reef's explanation. It is quite sociological. I do not know that it is, properly speaking, a psychoanalytical explanation. So you have to look at the properly Freudian explanation. That would be the dualistic one. You have a struggle between 2 kinds of drives, either the sexual drive against the ego drive or against the drive for self-preservation. But Freud sets this aside by the Eros-Thanatos split, where both Eros and Thanatos are on both sides of the struggle. They are both part of the question of repression, and yet they are both part of the question of representation, which is trying to break through repression. They so deeply contaminate one another that you cannot, strictly speaking, distinguish between the two. The French, analyst Laplanche rather cleverly says that rhetorically they amount to a chiasmus. He's at least partly right. You can't really work out the relation between Thanatos and Eros and beyond the pleasure principle without finally seeing them rhetorically as being rather chiasmic. They join together at one point, they separate at another, but they cannot be clearly distinguished from one another. But then you have a real question, which is, what is it that you are doing when you postulate this insistence on the entire question of the repression of the Verdrängung that bothered Freud for a great many years, and he finally in 1925 tried to solve it with his notion of Verneinung. I am going to expound that, and then we will have time today to work backwards, I hope, and move all the way back. This will only take me 5 minutes or so, but there are a few things I want to clarify about this question of negation, so as to move on to the question of sexuality in relation to repression 2 weeks from today. This will begin as a commentary on that little 5-page essay called Negation that I asked you to read for today, which strikes me as the most difficult, yet the most pungent and productive of all Freud's essays. But it's very late. It's written in 1925. Now, by 1925, all of Freud's formulations are in place. From 1925 until he dies in 1939, he elaborates. But his revisions, though they get darker and darker, do not essentially change his theory or map of the mind. Now, if I can at least expose and lead to some discussion in our time left today, why Freud was driven in 1925 to write the paper Negation, then we won't have wasted our time today. But I have to start with some of the peculiarities of this notion of negation, partly because as a German word it involves one in all sorts of complications. Verneinung, according to Freud, what he calls Verneinung or negation, is the formulation of a previously repressed representation, thought, feeling, desire, image, the formulation of a previously repressed. Now, as soon as you can formulate it, you see it's returned from the repressed. It enters consciousness, however, only by being disowned, so that emotionally or affectively speaking, defense continues. And yet cognitively, you have had a return from the repressed. Now that is an extraordinary and striking notion, and not a philosophic notion at all, because it is not, I believe, a dialectical notion, but I would insist a dualistic notion. Let me repeat that, and I'm using Freud's own language here, or the language of the strange translation. Verneinung or negation is the formulation, which means the advent in consciousness, the return from Verdrängung, of a previously repressed thought, feeling, desire, image, a representation, which, however, has entered consciousness only by being disowned, so that you let it in again, but you affectively disown it, so that defense is still continuing. Now, Verneinung, therefore, in a Freudian sense, would denote negation in what you might call a grammatical analogical sense, but also would include the notion of denial as disowning. So Verneinung is negation in this sense. The hysteric, Freud says in that little essay, responds to the treatment becoming effective by bringing the truth to light in the analytical session, while at the same time denying that the truth is being brought to light. So negation is that which takes cognizance of what is repressed by accepting it intellectually but not emotionally, and so thinking frees itself to a very limited degree from the restrictions of repression, or to use Freud's own language, cognition frees itself from its sexual past, though it cannot emotionally admit that freedom. Now that's a very complicated kind of a notion, and I want to do a little clarification of it, and then see if we can relate this to some of Freud's endless dilemmas about what he calls primal. Let me cite Wollheim, who is the most empirical and, you might say, least dialectical, least Lacanian of all Freudian interpreters. Wollheim relates this to Freud's realization that the ego is, after all, always a bodily ego. He thus points out that the defenses of introjection and projection and their origins are related to negations, and that therefore the intellectual faculty, or the capacity to assign truth or falsity to any assertion, is really a repetition of some very primitive movement of the mind, in which something like a thought is first felt within one, then either you swallow it up or spit it out. That's an interesting observation. It's a very interesting observation. Not a philosophical observation. It's a perfectly Humean or empirical observation on Wollheim's part, as you might expect. But there is, of course, as there would have to be, a more continental or dialectical notion of this, because of the rather curious fact that Freud, for reasons that I do not understand, I wish he hadn't done this, but as highly as I would insist, and as Wollheim would insist, non-Hegelian notion of Verneinung, insisted upon using the most famous of Hegelian words, Verneinung, or negation, or that which leads to the negative, or negative thinking. So that when he really was talking about psychical duplicity, he seemed to be talking about negation in a Hegelian sense, and with great hesitancy, and using up, I hope, no more than 3 or 4 minutes of our time, and still leaving us a little time for discussion today. Well, no, I'm not going to do it. I would rather have the discussion. I wanted to point out to you the sense in which this is not Hegelian, but that can wait for a further occasion. Let us do something instead. In the time we have left today, and we can legitimately certainly take a certain number of moments, well, not too many, can we, for discussion. What would you think is the deepest relation? If I can have even one surmise about this, I will be content. What might be the deepest relation between Freud's extraordinary reliance on this notion of negation, on the notion that thought could free itself from its sexual past to a limited degree, cognitively, though not affectively, so that you could have a cognitive return of the repressed, which would never be an affective or emotional return of the repressed, with the original notion of the opposition between the reality principle and the pleasure-unpleasure principles. What would you think that link is? Yes, let me hear yours.
Well, I think it sounds like that would be the basic reality principle, would be the extent that this freeing up of cognitism is free of this sexual web of eros, which is history, and which is that to the extent you can be freed of that intellectual sphere, that's where the reality.
I think you may well be right. So this is indeed to deal with Freud's thought on a very deep and complex and perhaps not fully formulated level. I feel almost as though, in his concept of negation, he is indeed, let me expand on that just a little, and then I'll end this for the day. He is indeed saying, how can we achieve reality testing? How can we achieve, though he would never have agreed to call it that, my own version of transcendence or value conferring? How can we be reconciled to reality, which is finally our sense that indeed even the narcissistic ego must come to an end? Well, we never can affectively. We can never emotionally accept the fact of our own death, but we can cognitively accept it. We can free thought from its sexual and narcissistic past only by splitting it, only by introjecting or swallowing up or identifying ourselves with its cognitive aspect while continuing to disavow or spit out or project its emotional aspect. Now, in doing that, he cut, I think, a rather more considerable gap in his theory of repression than probably he wanted to cut. But that relates more than to the whole question of sexuality and the neuroses and the perversions, and that is what we go on to 2 weeks from today. So look, in ending today, I remind you that the assignment is on the board, that I'll be holding office hours again 2 weeks from today at 2:30 in room 236, because next week, unless I'm greatly mistaken, there is no class here on Monday, or perhaps on some other days also. Thank you. It's a very brilliantly written piece of polemic, but let me return it to you immediately before I go off to New Haven, since it is your only copy. But I enjoyed it very much, my dear, and I would make no changes in it. So,